Welcome to the Kentucky Watershed Academy. This is Module 6, and this presentation will be looking at our target audience. Throughout this module, we've been progressing through the EPA's Getting in Step Guide's 6 steps of a watershed outreach campaign. They include defining the driving forces, goals, and objectives, identifying and analyzing the target audience, creating the message, packaging the message, distributing the message, and evaluating the outreach campaign. In this presentation, we're going to be focusing in on step 2, identifying and analyzing the target audience. Of all the steps in the process, this might be the most critical and the most unfamiliar to many of you. As an overview, we need to figure out who we want to reach to achieve our goals. This is our target audience. For example, a target audience for increasing streamside vegetation buffers may require identifying property owners along the stream corridor. Neighborhood associations can help promote the need, and another audience may be local officials who can develop and implement buffer ordinances. So it may be obvious or it may require research. Very generalized education outreach can help raise general awareness about a resource, but it is unlikely to result in real changes. It should only serve as a first step in the process. If you're not narrowing your audience, your awareness message could be ineffective or even counterproductive. You might want to break down the target audience into the most specific segments possible to receive a unified message and then tailor your message in a way that resonates with those segments. In this way, you are similar to a salesperson who's trying to convince your specific audience to buy into the attitudes or behaviors that will help satisfy their needs as well as yours. Think about what's in it for them. By figuring out what is important to the target audience, you can craft a message that is most effective. The process of identifying and analyzing the target audience has 9 steps listed here. That is, considering the potential audience, selecting a target audience, describing the target audience's characteristics, determining additional information that you need, describing their behaviors, knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions, as well as barriers and facilitators in the process. A consideration to further segment the audience, and then developing an audience profile. You may notice that in step 7, when you're looking to further segment the audience, you may end up going back to the beginning and redeveloping your procedures. That is, once you learn more about the audience, you may want to return to the process and focus in more so. Step 4 could also be placed with steps 5 or 6, but the idea is making sure you're keeping a running list of information that you need. We also want to note that we have tried to facilitate this process by providing worksheets to help guide you through this process. There are 4 worksheets that are provided in the Excel workbook that help cover these steps. You can see how they are broken down here. The first 2 steps are covered in the target audience form. Steps 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and really 8 as well, are all on the target audience form, with a focus in on the identifying barriers and facilitators in the removing barriers form. And then finally, once you understand your target audience, you're then ready to select the appropriate behavior to reach out to this audience through the behavior selection matrix form. In Module 5 of the Kentucky Watershed Academy, we discussed the difference between stakeholders and partners. A stakeholder is anyone who may help with the implementation of a watershed improvement or protection actions or is affected by them. This can include decision makers, residents or businesses in the area, individuals or organizations that can create roadblocks or smooth the road to success, as well as local historians or others who have information to contribute. For the sake of finding our target audience, it helps to clarify who the audience is as a whole. Before we narrow in on one specific group, we want to begin by taking the wide-angle view and listing out the potential audience. It's important to be thorough when considering potential audiences. Selecting a target audience is not intended to be exclusionary or divisive. Rather, it is intended to help focus on how to obtain the greatest change for a specific issue. This can be done through the selecting target audience form. Target audiences can be grouped in several ways depending on your objectives. As a starting point, consider grouping by geographic area, demographics, occupation, or behavior patterns. We're going to cover these groupings more in depth later when we characterize the audience. For right now, you're just trying to describe the full extent of the world of this issue of concern. Once you have thoroughly documented the potential audiences, you want to think through some screening questions to help you identify where to focus. Different audiences might be highlighted in each of these different questions. But taking the answers of the screening questions as a whole, this can help you identify where to focus your time. You might want to consider who's most affected, who's the most impacted group. What about the size of the audience? Is the size too big to be manageable or too small to need a full campaign? What about the criticality? How important is that specific audience's change in behavior? What about success? How likely is that behavior change to occur? And power. Who controls the behavior or the resources required for the change? So once you've gone through these different questions, you will want to select your target and explain why you made that decision. Here's an example for preventing the neighborhood flooding. You may want to pause here and take a moment to write down some ideas of potential audiences within each of these categories: key decision makers, affected audiences, and then roadblockers, those that can make the process difficult, and facilitators, those can make that process a lot easier. Here are some of our ideas. As far as key decision maker audiences, you might have the mayor, the city council members, uh, city engineer in the stormwater department, perhaps planning and zoning, people who own impervious surfaces that are contributing to the runoff, as well as people whose houses are being flooded. All of those decision makers matter. For affected audiences, you have the homeowners themselves that are being flooded. You have the city maintenance crews. You have the drivers on local roads, real estate agents, insurance agencies that may be paying for flooding. We have road crews that may have emergency situations or shutdowns or repairs. You have upstream businesses as well as the landowners there that are contributing to the runoff. You have downstream owners of lands that are on the stream who may be impacted by the erosion that's occurring there. You also have homeowners associations as well as neighborhood associations and emergency services. This is just a few that are affected by this flooding in a neighborhood. Who can facilitate the process or block it? Well, stormwater engineers, they certainly are important to facilitation. Developers, they may be supportive or may not be, depending on the practices that are recommended. Neighborhood associations, the FEMA or the flood insurance coordinators. Grants to purchase homes or properties for BMPs. That certainly would facilitate the process. Businesses willing to reduce their impervious area. So this gives an idea. We're painting this big picture idea of who is the potentially affected audience in this issue. Now you want to think through how would you answer the following questions. You may want to stop here, take some time, and write down your answers. We'll give you ours now. Who's impacted? Well, probably the most impacted people would be the people whose houses are actually being flowing. What about the size of the audience? Well, everyone upstream is a larger audience, as would be the owners. That's a larger audience. A much smaller audience would be addressing the city officials. Who's most critical? Well, those that are critical for addressing the runoff would be those upstream landowners. They would also be important for increasing the detention So putting in detention basins or something like that, working with those landowners would be important. If you're looking to purchase or remove homes in the area, that's going to be critical. But probably city officials are most critical to all of these. They're going to have to be involved in that process one way or the other. Upstream landowners or flooded homes are probably the next most critical. What about success? That depends on the amount of water that you need to reduce, but an engineering model would be necessary to estimate that. A city-funded project would be more likely to be successful than individual homeowner actions. Who has power? Well, the power is really going to be found with the mayor, or the city engineer, or the magistrate of the area who is able to move a project like this forward. So in the end, taking all of these together, you would probably want to target the city officials first. However, if they are already aware of the issues and not willing to take action, you might want to bring together the homeowners to advocate for the problem. Lastly, if they're not able to gain traction and develop a grant or a project to fix the flooding issues, then perhaps the next step would be to approach the upstream owners with large impervious surface areas to see if they might be willing to implement projects to reduce the stormwater runoff quantities or install detention basins on their properties. While we've talked about some questions that are useful in helping determine the target audience, one thing that needs to be considered is the social norms of the audience. Social norms are the standards of behavior and attitudes that are considered normal, accepted, and expected in a community. When trying to change social norms, it's important to know where to start and how to gain a critical mass. In deciding which segment of your audience to target, you should think about the concept of social diffusion, which states that once a new behavior or idea is adopted by 15 to 20% of an audience, it then has the critical acceptance to spread through the remainder of the audience. This theory was developed by Dr. Everett Rogers following 30 years of research assessing 5 categories of people within an audience that generally adopt new behaviors in sequential stages and at fairly predictable rates. The stages are 1. Innovators, 2. Early adopters, 3. The early majority, 4. The late majority, and 5. The laggards. This theory was also popularized by Malcolm Gladwell's tipping points, which shows how it can apply to pandemics, crime, fashion trends, and other widely differing issues. By identifying which categories the members of your audience might fall into, you can better understand when and how to motivate them. Many outreach campaigns fail because organizers believe they need to focus heavily on targeting the late majority and laggard segments of the audience, since those segments encompass the greatest number of people. However, those segments are the hardest people to reach and the hardest to convince that they should change their behavior. People in these categories will not even consider changing until the idea has become well accepted by a solid majority of the target audience. Focus instead on preaching to the choir would be the recommendation of social diffusion theory. The innovators and the early adopters. Once you've successfully reached these people, they can help spread the word through their own circles to reach people in other categories. You may also want to be aware of connectors, that is, people who are strong, diverse social networkers, as well as mavens, which are information accumulators for the purposes of distribution. They like spreading information for the joy of it. These individuals can help connect you to the right people and provide you with the right type of information for your projects. Innovators and early adopters typically make up about 16% of the audience. So you're almost to the tipping point for the message spread if you convince those two categories of people. If you can continue the message spread to the early majority, you're potentially able to reach and sway 50% of your audience with your messaging. According to the theory of social diffusion, the rest will slowly come with time. As a case study of this idea, Often, especially in the eastern United States, a lush lawn is seen as desirable, and there is some social pressure to maintain a well kept, green expanse of grass on your property. If others in your neighborhood are using a lawn care company to fertilize their grass or they're personally fertilizing their lawn, there may be social pressure for you to do the same. It may be that the homeowners are not aware of the potential impacts to water quality from heavy nutrient runoff when fertilizers are over applied or applied just before a rain event. So there's the whole keeping up with the Joneses type mentality. This is what we mean. You're looking for the innovators or the early adopters to begin to put these practices in place and then spread the word to other neighbors. This gives you an idea of what we mean by the social innovation theory, and we've covered some of the questions along the way. So at this point in time, go ahead and develop your potential audiences and work through selecting a target audience. You may need to refine this later, but you should have a good idea of how to start at this point in time. In order to develop an effective message that connects with the audience, you'll need to do some sleuthing to figure out what they think about the issue and what messages might engage and motivate them. Remember, we are selling our watershed customers a product. This product could be environmental awareness to start with, then organizational membership or help with stream restoration project or a voluntary behavior change or something else. One category to evaluate is socio-demographics, which helps you define the socio-economic makeup of that target audience. This information will allow you to think about the appropriate messaging and how individuals may be able to engage and participate. If the area includes mainly retired persons, they may be more available for daytime activities and have the freedom to volunteer, for example. Another category to consider would be the geographic distribution of audience members with regard to the watershed issues. Is the population all within one or more specific neighborhoods? Is it only in a specific zoning type? What details can help identify methods to connect them that may not otherwise be apparent? Investigations to understand the attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions, or psychographic factors, will help you to link the watershed issues with the audience's concerns. If they don't see the issue as a concern or don't understand how it affects an environmental value, you may need to step in and help make those connections to your audience. And if your organization is not perceived favorably by the target audience, you may need an intermediary to help convey your message. You need to understand some of the key values and interests of your audience and appeal to those. You'd probably approach a hobby farmer different than a full-time professional farmer. Think of the unique behaviors and interests that help focus on the audience. By figuring out ways that your audience gets their information, you can develop, format, and distribute their message. Are there any newsletters or newspapers that people pay attention to? Is there an electronic message board or something like that that people pass on or they see it in a business? Do people tune into a local radio station? Should you use airplane banners? That may not be realistic, but it's important for you to understand what they trust and what they don't trust so you know how to reach out. And then there's piggybacking opportunities based on other known factors. You want to get into the nitty gritty of the social dynamics and the relationships to help you figure out how to best communicate. Who talks to who? What are the influential decision makers and leaders in the community? Understanding community culture will help you to avoid blunders and connect with the leaders of that community. Now, at this point, you might be going into shock or feeling overwhelmed that you don't know a lot of this information about your audience, and that's okay. Many outreach campaigns are structured on an ad hoc basis, seizing upon the low-hanging fruit. What's important is that you begin to make a list of what you need to know and explore ways to collect this information so that you could then develop a more focused strategy rather than relying on these ad hoc principles. So where can you get this information? Well, here we've provided some of the places where you can start your search. These tools depend on your audience composition and your available time and money. First, you can try checking with similar organizations and see what they may be able to share about their information sources. This slide provides a listing of possible info sources. Don't worry about the need to use all of these sources in characterizing your audience. Any info on the audience is helpful to strengthening the success of your campaign. Demographic databases, such as the U.S. Census Bureau's, contain all kinds of info that can be helpful in determining the makeup of potential audiences. If you want help, consider asking a college marketing class or some other related class for help as a real-world project for them to pursue. We'll show a tool to help access some of this data quickly in just a few slides. The census data has its limits, particularly due to how some of the tracts are divided and they're drawn. So it should be ground truth, but is nonetheless an essential resource. Local public agencies, such as property value agencies or PVA offices, as well as planning departments, can also be valuable sources of information. Health departments may also be able to offer insights and details about on-site wastewater or septic systems, their use, as well as problem areas. Be sure to give plenty of lead time for these efforts and keep information confidential to preserve your reputation as well as your credibility. Trade associations may be able to provide info on your targeting audience and may serve as a conduit for delivering your message. For example, if you want to find out which dry cleaners use eco-friendly processes, you may want to reach out to Associated Trade Group to see if they can help. Your local Chamber of Commerce may also be a helpful resource to find info on local businesses and the demographics of the community. Here's the section of the worksheet where you can summarize this information. Though that you just need to have some bullet points. Make sure to keep track of the sources of your information for later reference. We noted briefly that the census data is a great source of information about your audience. One of the easiest ways to quickly extract this information at the tract level is through the EPA's Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tool, or the EJ Screen Mapper. You can see the web address located on the slide. You can add maps with all sorts of census data overlays, as well as different environmental layers. By clicking on an individual tract, you can then get a quick picture of what is going on in that area. In this instance, we have color-coded low-income populations around Lexington, and you can see some of the summary statistics that are provided to identify vulnerable populations that are shown by clicking on a tract. If you're looking for county-level data, the CEDIC community assessments may also be a helpful tool for you. As we mentioned previously, don't panic about what you do not know. Just start making a list and a plan to collect that information. Now, this step, determining additional information that's needed, could be considered after the subsequent 2 steps in this process, but it does make sense to pause here and make these considerations. We're actually going to spend an entire presentation focusing on how you can collect much of this information through different types of social survey research tools. Some of those tools that we're going to cover include the use of surveys, interviews and focus groups, community or neighborhood forums, direct observations, that is going out and observing what people actually do, as well as doing cultural assessments or community characterizations. You probably also want to begin to think about how to track changes in the audience over time due to your outreach efforts. We're going to touch on that more in step 6 of the evaluation. So you can see whether you have the data currently or you're looking to start collecting, or you're just going to monitor the changes, you probably need to start making this list of information that you're going to need as time progresses. There are also a number of resources out there that have done some of the legwork for you on a given audience. For instance, the University of Wisconsin Extension Service has a lot of great content on how to change behavior and conduct for outreach and education campaigns. Their publication, Outreach That Makes a Difference, describes 15 different audiences and gives research support for ways to engage and educate in different scenarios. For example, in dealing with a target audience of recreational water users, they recommend not using representative stakeholders because the interests can vary so much depending on the age, education, gender, and income level of the recreational users of the resource. They recommend doing direct surveys and interviews and engaging them while they are participating in the activities themselves. Uh, these are just a few of the audience related insights that are compiled at that resource. You can see the link at the bottom of this slide. To give an example of some of the information that's needed to characterize an audience, we present here a literature survey of some general factors that were found to positively influence BMP adoption by farmers. You may not be studying a farmer target audience, but you can find similar types of surveys for other groups. This study in this literature review looked at other studies associated with farmers and is just a subset of the large amount of data that they compiled. It's intended to give you an idea of some of the kinds of bullet points that you might gather for your specific audience. You could take this general national research survey and then you could supplement it with specific bullet points for farmers in your area. So as a result of this survey, they found that information that was provided to the audience was very important. It needed to be timely, technical information, and that in-person dissemination was very effective. They also found that financial incentives, subsidies, or loans positively influenced that BMP adoption. If their neighbors were doing it, or they were encouraged by their friends or family or ag agencies, that was a positive effect. They found that if a family member is planning to take over a farm, or if they were at a higher caste or income, that would often positively affect BMP adoption. Conservation risk tolerance and a positive time preference showed whether they were willing to invest in this BMP adoption. They also had to be aware of the impacts and they had to have intentions towards environmental stewardship. Finally, they looked at the characteristics of the farm and they found that communication between the renter and the owner was positively influenced with the adoption, as well as access to the labor. So this gives you an idea of just quick bullet points under these different items that can be followed up upon for farmers in your area and give you some ideas of where and how to target that audience. Now it's your turn to get started. We've provided some examples of the types of information that you need. Why don't you take a few minutes to work through the target audience form and think through what you know and make a list of some additional items that you might need. Again, don't be concerned if you don't know much. Begin to think through how you might collect the idea, the types of surveys that can be used at this point in time. In our next step, we wanted to break out some of the specific questions related to water quality for the audience. These are going to be more locally specific, so you might need to do surveys to determine these answers or interview local organizations or community members. These questions will help you to determine where the audience is on the spectrum of awareness and implementation and whether or not your organization needs to be taking the lead in communicating. These questions include: what water quality related activities do they currently engage in and why? What is the knowledge base of the audience on these watershed issues? What is their view of your organization? Do they think there is a problem? And if so, who's responsible? And finally, what stage of change is the audience in? You may have been wondering what the stage of change item meant. And this refers back to the theory of stages of behavior change. Depending on what stage of change the audience is in, you may want to engage in different strategies. For each step in the behavior change, the corresponding strategy indicates how to move them to the next step. So if folks are unaware of a problem, then an awareness campaign is called for. However, if they are already aware, then you may need to focus on motivating. For those who are prepared to take action, they will need education. Those who are acting may need to make progress. And finally, those that have adopted the behavior may need to be reminded in order to keep doing so. The next step in the process is to consider the barriers to change that might be in place, as well as facilitators who might make change easier. There are many reasons that barriers to action for more sustainable behaviors may exist. They may be unaware of the impacts of the current behaviors on water quality. They may think that more sustainable behavior is too inconvenient, it costs too much, takes too long, or is socially unacceptable. They might think their personal change in behavior can't make it a real impact. They just can't make a difference. It's important to figure out how to minimize or remove these barriers so that the perceived benefit outweighs the cost or extra effort that's involved. We've provided you with a more detailed form to think through these barriers through a series of questions with the goal of adding to your target audience characterization form. You also want to think through who can make change easier. That is, identifying people that can facilitate the process and make the entire thing go more smoothly. Pet waste is a great case study of barriers to actions and efforts to overcome them. Many people do not pick up their waste from their pets. What do you think might be some of the barriers to their action? Perhaps they think it's gross, and so they may say, I don't have time to deal with it. Maybe they think it's part of nature and will biodegrade quickly. Or they think that it's fertilizer for the grass. Or nobody will notice them if they don't pick it up. Perhaps they're unaware that it's a major pollutant contributor to streams, and that each gram of dog poop contains over 20 million E. coli bacteria colonies, plus nitrogen and phosphorus. Educational campaigns have attempted to help overcome awareness barrier, and handy pet waste stations make it easier and less unappealing. In diagnosing some of the barriers to implementing farming in BMPs, often we find that cost, time, labor, or social norms are mentioned as problems. Well, how do you move through these barriers? Farm demonstration days are a great way to get farmers better acquainted with conservation practices, their potential costs, the labor and time benefits by seeing them in action with a local farmer in the area, someone they can trust. Appreciative signage, as shown in this example from the Hanging Fork watershed, is a good way to start adjusting the social norm towards acceptance. As we approach the end of our target audience characterization process, it's good to develop an audience profile. That is a general short summary of the audience that we're talking about. There are two different types of summaries, and we will provide examples of each of these. For a profile, you want to focus more on quantitative data that's collected on the audience and information that answers questions about what, why, and who. In other words, what are they doing? Why are they doing that? And what are the specific demographics, that is age group or whatever it might be associated with that group. The second audience summary is called a persona. This is more of a qualitative, so less numbers, more text summary based on interviews or correspondence with the audience or organizations that commonly work with them. This is not about statistics, but it involves developing an informed composite characterization in vivid detail in order to picture who you're trying to communicate with. Obviously, you want to be careful of bias here. So developing this persona based on community interactions is important. Here's an example of a quantitative profile. The University of Florida Extension Service used an online survey of over 1,000 respondents to understand how people are irrigating their landscape to direct their conservation efforts. You can see a list here of the topics that they covered in their survey. They looked at environmental issues, irrigation water sources, the HOA status, current conservation behaviors, likelihood of engaging in future practices, familiarity with water-related programs, importance of plentiful clean water, confidence in water safety and availability, interactions with extension, political beliefs, and demographics. So a very broad, wide-ranging survey that was conducted. Based on the results of the survey, they identified three major audiences. the water considerate majority, the water savvy conservationists, and the unconcerned water users. They summarize the different variables that cause them to be lumped into these different groups. And based on the responses, they decided to target the water considerate majority with the outreach. So this one used a survey with statistics in order to develop a profile. These folks tend to be more moderate in their beliefs, their behavior, and their irrigation attitudes. They were somewhat engaged in the process, somewhat likely to engage. They perceived, some importance of clean water, and so it's looking to bump them up into the more water savvy group. Here's an example of a profile that uses bullet points. This example is from marketing organic protein bars, so not water quality related, but it gives an idea of how the information is summarized. You've got a quick idea that this audience looks like, and some ideas how to communicate with them. So you got an age range. You see the gender is equally distributed. They're trying to be healthy, hang out with friends and nature, feels loyalty, finds it difficult to eat healthy food when they're busy, has a limited budget, needs a protein source. So this gives an example of how are you going to market to this different to this group. What are the images that you're going to use? How are you going to reach out to them? Social media, videos, events. This gives you a very, again, quick bulleted summary of how to approach that audience. So far we've used profiles, but here's an example of an audience persona from the Harvard Business Review with a goal of describing different types of green consumers with a goal of selling them green products. So notice the vivid descriptions in this persona, in this case for resource conservers. So conservers hate waste. They're wearing classic clothing, cloth shopping bags, reusable water bottles, recyclers of milk jugs and Tide bottles. They drop off their electronics at Best Buy, read online to save trees. You get an idea of going through this list of the types of products that these resource conservers are using and addressing through these vivid, specific descriptions. That begins to give you an idea of who these people are and how to market to them. Now, again, you're not marketing a product; you're marketing a behavior. Maybe it's planting a riparian zone, or reducing fertilizer use, or something like that. But these types of descriptions help you to understand who the audience is. So if you've come to the place where you're able to provide a short summary and a persona or a profile of your audience, you have a pretty good idea of the people that you're trying to appeal to. And so you should be able to return to your behavior selection matrix with a fresh set of eyes. You may want to add some additional behaviors because you know the audience better. And you're now ready to make an informed assessment of the audience's views on various aspects of the project. And so you can score the proposed behaviors less subjectively. So we have different categories in which to evaluate each one of the behaviors. And these include the following: the highest reduction in pollution, the most affordable to promote, the most affordable to adopt, most attractive to the community, easiest to link to the problem, most sustainable, does it have additional water quality benefits, the highest consumer response, or the fewest barriers to overcome. Here we see an example of the matrix that was created by a group to determine the most effective ways to help reduce nutrient runoff from residential areas. We considered this in an earlier presentation from listing out some of the potential behaviors that could be utilized. At this point in the process, we're going to look at scoring each one of these behaviors. In this case, on a score from 1 to 6, with 1 being the least likely and 6 being the most likely. And you can give the same score to different behaviors if applicable. Each one of these columns are then taken, summed up into a total score, and in this case, reducing the fertilizer application from twice a year to once a year rated as the highest. and therefore that is the behavior that should be promoted. Having progressed through some detailed sheets, you're now ready to fill in an overview format on the building blocks of the overview worksheet what that target audience is. Now please note, you'll need to do this for each objective, and you might have several different target audiences for a given objective. You can include the descriptions of the target audiences in your report. However, if the audience is extremely small, you may want to keep the audience descriptions internal for privacy purposes. Please note that it does not always take this level of detail and analysis to generate the target audiences. Sometimes the audience is apparent, and such analysis is overkill. Also, it is often the case that several objectives will utilize the same target audience, and therefore you might end up with just a few target audiences for your watershed plan. We hope that you've enjoyed this presentation on how to determine and characterize your target audience. Please stay with us as we look at some of the social survey research tools and then begin to delve more into how to create a message to address the audience. Thank you.